Hello and welcome to this episode of Reasoned UK. Now don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit the little notification bell as well to make sure that you don't miss out on any future content, and do consider following us on social media as well. Now in December, the Labour Party suffered its biggest rejection at the ballot box since the 1930s. The party of London's Liberals and young people lost support in places such as Bolsover, Sunderland and Doncaster, where my guests today argue that after nearly a decade of the Tory party or a Tory-led government, the Labour Party should be romping home, right? So it's its Brexit policy, I would argue, that's holding it back. It played a large part in exposing the chasm between the Labour Party, the Parliamentary Labour Party, and its voters, its one-time voters. The deceit of a political party that promised it would respect the biggest vote for anyone or anything then seemed to do all it could to overturn that vote or stop its implementation. But are things about to change? Sir Keir Starmer is now leader of the Labour Party, and he's been making some positive soundings on being open to patriotism, as the party of Barbara Castle and Peter Shaw once was. And he's also, well, he was met with a torrent of abuse, I should add, by FBPE tweeters and some Labour Party activists for doing that. He disappointed them further, though, by refusing to join the Lib Dems and the SNP by dodging a question on support and calls for an extension to the Brexit transition period. But should we not forget that the man was the architect of Labour's second referendum policy and ultimately its betrayal on Brexit. After all, voters aren't fools. Anyway, that's enough for me. Let's see what our guests think. Roll the tape. We've got today stalwarts of the Labour movement. Paul Embery is a firefighter, trade unionist activist and pro-Brexit campaigner, and a Blue Labour thinker as well. Brendan Chilton. Brendan, are you still a Labour councillor?
I am indeed, yes.
And a former parliamentary candidate. He was head of the Labour Leave campaign during the EU referendum. So hello to both of you. How's lockdown going for you?
Marvellous.
well, everyone else is growing a beard, as you can see. I've got a bit of hair going up there as well on top. But yeah, it's been wonderful, hasn't it, for everybody?
We were just saying how young you look.
Cutters.
Yeah. Yeah, yours looks amazing, actually.
Well, thank you.
Now, I want to talk first of all about the B word, Brexit. Now, through Brexit, I think, and it's the reason I've partly got you both here with us today, there's been an accidental alliance, hasn't there, between two groups alienated by the modern liberal establishment and holding, those sort of small c conservative values. And I wonder if I can ask both of you how it's been over the past 4 years or so, finding these new alliances with perhaps once sworn political enemies that you have both over the years campaigned and railed against. And within some pockets of the left, there seems to be this hatred of anyone who doesn't share your belief system or political ideology. I think back to, well, I wasn't alive, obviously, but Nye Bevan's vermin remark being one of the most famous jibes in political history. Has it been a weird experience for you two? Finding these new alliances with one-time sworn enemies? I'll start with you, Brendan.
Not particularly, no, because actually, at first, we were all when the referendum was called, we were all very apprehensive about working on a cross-party basis because we knew it would immediately cause problems within our party. We'd be regarded as pariahs and sort of, scum, for want of a better word, and we've been called that many times since this episode began. But once we got into it and we both realised, I think the Conservatives and Labour side as well realised we had common ground, our overriding mission was to get us out of the European Union, it was quite easy. There were some differences in style and differences in approach, but on the whole, it worked very, very well. The real trouble has been sort of rehabilitating ourselves back into the Labour movement, which has been extremely hostile on occasions to us, and sort of said you ought not to be in. I mean, I know Paul's had, which he can talk about, great troubles with his union. But yes, it's been a tough time, but it was worth doing, absolutely worth doing.
Paul?
Yeah, I think those alliances have developed, and that alliance was essentially between the once loyal Labour voters in the old working class heartlands and some more middle class voters, in the Tory shires and suburbs, if you like. And these are people who, by and large, don't feel completely supportive, let's say, of the kind of liberal progressive agenda of much of the establishment these days. And I think that was explained well by David Goodhart in his book, The Road to Somewhere, where he talked about the country being kind of divided between the somewheres and anywheres. So somewheres make up about 50% of the population, anywheres about 25%, with the rest in between us. And the somewheres are, much more rooted, tend to be a little bit poorer, not university educated, live in some of those post-industrial heartlands, quite communitarian in outlook, some socially conservative views, but millions of them would regard themselves as tribally Labour. And also falling into that category would probably be the more kind of middle class conservatives from the shires and the suburbs. The problem is our establishment is by and large governed, dominated by the anywhere brigade, who tend to be a bit wealthier, more educated, better travelled in the professional occupations, more liberal, cosmopolitan in outlook. And what they do is they govern in the anywhere interest, whilst thinking they're actually governing in the national interest, because they see the rest of the world from London and from their vantage point in the cities. They don't see the world from provincial Britain and from some of those neglected post-industrial small town areas, neglected coastal areas, etc. And my assessment is that this trend, this, as you called it, the accidental alliance, had been developing for some time, completely uncoordinated and incoherent, but nonetheless, it was brewing, and I think it manifested itself in Brexit, where people said, look, not only do we not particularly like the European Union, because we do think it meddles with our democracy, we do think it is overbearing, we would like to control our money, our laws, our borders, but I feel it was also a kickback at the British ruling elite, who for so long had treated these people with contempt. So it was anti-EU, but also anti the sort of liberal ruling class in Britain. And the fallout from that, I think, was obvious that they tried to stop it going through, having not listened to these people for so long and ignored them. The British people said, right, you're not going to ignore us any longer. And then once they cast that vote, that's exactly what they did do. They carried on ignoring them. So that's I think that's the genesis of the whole thing, personally.
Brendan, what was it like then, it being a former parliamentary candidate and then having the party come at you quite strong for daring to campaign for Brexit?
Well, we had some very peculiar experiences in the referendum itself. I mean, we received one day a letter. We were invited across the country to many constituency Labour parties and trade union branches to speak on the debate. And one day an edict came out from the central office saying you ought not to be debating this, you should be campaigning to remain. And we had a wonderful occasion where one of our speakers had turned up to a particular Labour Party constituency in London. I won't name it for cause of embarrassment at this stage, but he turned up. An MEP at the time was on the platform, and the executive of the local party there and then uninvited him and said, you're not speaking yet. He travelled all the way across London to speak. So he jumped up on the stage, and the Labour Party has got a wonderful rule book that you can exploit to your own ends in meetings. And he jumped up and called for a proposer to allow him to speak. Someone did it, someone seconded it, and the room voted overwhelmingly to reject the advice of the General Management Committee, and he was allowed to speak. So that was a triumph in itself. But it was these sort of tools that we were up against. We'd have occasions where speakers sometimes travel all the way up to Cumbria, and when they got there, they found themselves uninvolved and uninvited. And it was a deliberate attempt to stop an alternative perspective being put, because I think Labour MPs in those constituencies were seeing, as Paul described, the core vote, the traditional loyal level vote, Occupy states, the tower blocks, the terraces, abandoning the party and saying, actually, we don't want to listen to your recommendation to vote to remain. We believe in leave. And so the party, when they saw this, started to panic, and so these techniques were deployed against us. In the aftermath of the referendum, once the result came through, after we all sobered up, we checked our inboxes, and I tell you, the grief and the abuse I had from people who were friends, people I'd been to university with, people who were in my own Labour group on my local authority, wanted to haul me up before the local management committee and interview me and find out what on earth I'd been up to and why this had happened. And I thought, for heaven's sake, it's democracy. If you don't like it, tough. Fight for 30 years and get the public to change their mind, as we have done. I think just a point that Paul touched on the alliances. I think the really interesting element there was the word Paul used, which was uncoordinated, and it was entirely uncoordinated. You found yourself mixing. We at one point there was the Communist Party sent speakers to events. That was fun, and you found yourself in a peculiar position where you had someone like Bill Cash, a Tory right, Tory grandee, agreeing with some organiser from the Communist Party from Clapham, and it was really funny to see. But they were agreeing on the common message, which was we should leave.
Paul, speaking of getting up on stages, you got up at the Leave Means Leave rally was it in March 2019?
Yeah, it was a rally that was due to be held on the day we were originally supposed to leave the European Union, yeah.
And then your union wasn't best pleased about this, and you've been trying to fight that decision ever since, haven't you?
Yeah, it's a slight understatement to say they weren't best pleased about it. The rally, as I say, March 29 to 2019, which was the day that we were originally supposed to leave the EU, the Theresa May government had sought an extension and got one. So there was quite a bit of anger about that because people felt that democracy was being denied. And there was a huge rally organised by the cross-party group Leave Means Leave, who Brendan himself obviously is well aware of. And it was a very good rally, and it was as I said, cross-party. There were speakers from the left and speakers from the right. My union had obviously campaigned for Remain, but we'd always had a very rich tradition in our union of people being free to put their own personal views if they do so in a personal capacity. And actually that's a tradition that goes across the trade union movement, people being free to express their views if those views don't accord with their official union line, and as long as they make it clear they're doing so in a personal capacity. That had always been the established position in my union. And I spoke at that rally on a Friday evening. It was in my own time. It was outside of my FBU working hours. There was no reference whatsoever to the Fire Brigades Union at the event. I was not introduced as a Fire Brigades Union official. But nonetheless, they decided to discipline me, and the specific thing they disciplined me, or the specific thing they removed me from office for, was not actually for attending. That's not why I was sacked from the national executive of the union, but specifically for something that I said during the speech. I said during the speech that I felt that leaders of the Labour movement were in danger of making the movement irrelevant amongst working class communities because they'd taken the side of the establishment over the people. And it was that specific criticism that led to a complaint being made against me and me being removed from office. So it was very clearly a political act. It was very clearly an attempt to crack down on dissent, and it's something that I think has come back to bite the people responsible for it.
Well, exactly, because I want to ask both of you, what do you think explains the Labour Party's obsession with the European Union? Because, I mean, if I just list off some of the issues with the project once touted by Delors as being a workers' paradise, unemployment is rife throughout the EU area. The monetary union has clearly failed, thank God we never joined that, and crony capitalism is rife. And there's a wholesale rejection now by the movement, by the Labour movement and trade unions, of that old Bennite cause of greater democracy being a central feature of our national and economic independence. Brendan, I'll start with you.
Well, quite right. And it always amazes me, particularly when you look at what's going on in the south of the continent. Mass unemployment in Greece, forced restructuring of the economy in Greece with sales of their national assets and privatisation of utilities, the similar conditions going on in Italy and in Spain. Whenever there's been a judgment, the EU courts have had to determine in favour of workers or the employers. They've always chosen employers. A single market is nothing more than the ability of the market to move, and Paul has said this in the past most brilliantly, they treat workers as commodities that can just be moved around the continent willy-nilly as employers need them. So I've always been absolutely astounded as to why the Labour Party has been so pro-EU, bearing in mind for the overwhelming majority of its history, it was not pro-EU. Right up until the late 80s, the Labour Party was a predominantly Eurosceptic party, and the last great rebellion on Europe by the Eurosceptics was when John Smith was leader of the Labour Party. And a whole section of the Labour Party rebelled against the Maastricht vote when he was leader, and then also there were rebellions under Blair. I think, though, in terms of the Labour movement, trade unions on the whole and the Labour Party on the whole have kind of used the EU as a safety net. We haven't got to work as hard at being good trade unionists. We haven't got to work as hard as being a good Labour Party, because we can always fall back on Europe if we get centre-left governments in all those EU countries, which we don't have at the moment. I think there is a realisation going on now, though. I think the Labour Party is starting, and particularly a lot of defeated Labour candidates at the last general election have been a lot more vocal since they were defeated. If they'd done it before, they might not have been defeated, on how the EU is not necessarily this workers' paradise that's being presented.
I think it was a lack of confidence. I think Brendan's assessment was pretty much bang on. I think it can be traced to the late 80s, when the trade union movement in this country had taken a battering under Margaret Thatcher. We'd seen the defeat of the miners, we'd seen reductions in trade union membership up and down the country, and the trade union movement, I think, was looking for a saviour to come along, and Jacques Delors famously turned up at the TUC Congress in the late 80s and sold the trade union movement the idea of a workers' Europe as some sort of bulwark against the Thatcher government in Britain. And it was a complete turnaround. As Brendan said, there has always been a very rich Eurosceptic tradition within the Labour movement. If you look at the Common Market referendum in 1975, the majority of trade unions voted no in that referendum. And I think it really is a talking point, because the way that the movement has moved from a broad position of EU scepticism to one bordering on EU fanaticism is quite incredible. And the idea that the EU is actually some guardian of workers' rights, some progressive, enlightened institution, I think is just simply wrong. It's an explicitly anti-socialist organisation. It's an organisation that has got market forces and neoliberalism at its heart. It's fundamentally anti-democratic. You only have to look at some of the rules around state aid and public ownership and the Stability and Growth Pact, which can limit investment, etc. And I really do object to the idea, and this was something that was peddled by trade union leaders during the referendum, almost that the only way we can guarantee workers' rights in this country is by having an undemocratic institution like the EU deliver them for us. Let's be clear, the history of the trade union movement shows that the vast majority of workers' rights that we enjoy in Britain today came about as a result of the UK Parliament enacting legislation as a result of trade union struggle, the national minimum wage, trade union recognition, etc. And I think by suggesting that only through being a member of the EU can we defend our rights, I think the trade union leadership is completely undermining the history and trashing the history of the trade union movement, and actually sowing cynicism among workers about what they can achieve in the future. And it's almost a fringe position now in the Labour movement to be anti-EU, but you look at some of the giants of the Labour movement, the Tony Benns, the Bob Crowes, the Peter Shaws, the Michael Foots, the Barbara Castles, who represent that broad tradition of Euroscepticism, and that's something that I think needs to be won back.
I mean, of the 54 seats that the Tories gained from Labour, 50 of them voted leave. If surely that sums up the importance of Labour's position on Brexit as far as the last election's concerned. But if you ask any Labour Party, I think most Labour Party members, not that I've asked them all myself, but I reckon they would argue that it wasn't Labour's position on Brexit. If anything, they would argue Labour wasn't Remain enough. Do you think that's right?
Well, they're all mad.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality of the situation is, if you can go back further than that, Darren, if you go back to when Ed Miliband was leader, and the question of whether or not there ought to be a referendum, the principle was being discussed. Labour in the 2015 general election lost seats, and there's evidence out there to prove this, precisely because we opposed the having of a referendum. And one of the seats that we lost was Ed Balls' seat. And that constituency, in research undertaken by the then People's Pledge campaign, which was one of the old campaigns that began pushing for a referendum, shows that actually, had we been in favour of a referendum in that seat, we could have deprived the Tories of a majority. And then again, we lost seats to Cameron, again, when he formed the majority government, when he promised to hold the referendum. And for people like us that have been going around the party and speaking at conferences and on platforms for years on this, we've seen it coming. When we did the huge rallies during the referendum all over the north and the northeast and Wales, the audience that we spoke to weren't sort of, ex-colonels from the shires, swivelling gin on a Sunday afternoon. They were working class Labour voters, and they'd been Labour their whole lives. And we were standing on the platform telling them that leave was important. And they were coming up to us at the end when you sort of mingle. And they were saying, we can't vote Labour anymore. We want to leave and your party wants to remain. We're pleased you're here, obviously. But the party's abandoned us on this massive issue. And so they're also, before the election last year, where we didn't do quite as well as we'd hoped. Before that, we lost a load of seats to Theresa May as well, or gained seats. We lost some to Theresa May, and there's been this sort of movement as well. So it's going to be a massive, massive mountain to climb to come back. And some of these Tory majorities now, I mean, where I am down in the southeast, Dover's got a 12,000 Tory majority. It's unbelievable. And in parts of the Midlands, you've got, Bassettlaw's got a 15,000 Tory majority? I mean, this is the end of days.
We'll get on to how Labour can fight back as far as that's concerned. But I want to talk about 10 years on from Duffygate. Now, to what extent, Paul, do you reckon that Labour Party's enthusiasm for free movement, or a more laissez-faire approach to immigration policy in general, has been one of the principal causes of that disconnect between the party and its traditional base?
I think it's been significant. I think that the Labour Party, or a large part of the Labour movement's support for the principle of open borders and a much more liberalised immigration policy has caused unease and anxiety in some of those working class communities, some of the Red Wall seats that we lost. And I think that was on the cards, because I think that they looked at the Labour Party and realised that the Labour Party, a large part of it, was just completely tin-eared to some of their concerns. And too many people in the Labour Party pitched it as a debate between those who are progressive and enlightened and those, on the other hand, who are reactionary and bigoted. Either you were in favour of completely open borders, or if you weren't, then you were completely anti-immigration. And it was a false dichotomy, and it was a false debate. And in my experience, the vast majority of people, including the people in those working class communities, are broadly in favour of immigration. They just want it to be managed and controlled in such a way that it doesn't cause disruption, social and economic, in their communities, and pressure on wages in certain sectors, as we've seen, such as construction and hospitality and retail, etc. And the problem is, by taking this extreme line of open borders and supporting EU free movement, and not listening to those concerns, it completely poisoned the debate, because the whole debate around immigration became toxified. And whereas we could, in theory, have had a sensible policy where the whole thing was managed properly. In fact, we've now got a binary debate, or we did have a binary debate, where people were just dismissed as being reactionary and nativist and bigoted if they didn't believe in completely open borders. The other point I think that needs to be made is the open borders position in the Labour movement is relatively a new one. The majority of socialists and trade unionists until recently, in my view, were, though in favour of immigration, were against an open borders position because they realised that it was important for any government to be able to manage the dynamics of a market economy, and the labour supply is simply a dynamic of a market economy which needs regulating like all other market dynamics, and a left government should of course seek to manage the labour supply to be able to plan around housing and welfare and employment and so on. The open borders position was, once upon a time a position that was only held by Trotskyists and uber liberals and anarchists, really, but now it's the opposite position that has become a fringe position within the labour movement, and it's been a boss's dream because it has allowed bosses to be able to recruit labour from low wage economies into high wage economies in order to be able to hold down wages. There's two sides to it, because what that means is we've seen some depopulation crisis in some of those low wage economies. So, for example, in Romania, they've got a crisis in their health service where a lot of their doctors have left the country. That's not necessarily to do with the low wage thing to high wage thing particularly, but nonetheless, since EU accession, Romanian doctors in their droves have moved abroad, and that's created a health crisis there. In Latvia, they've got a depopulation crisis because many of their workers have moved abroad. So people need to examine exactly what the effects of free movement are, and for Labour it's been a disaster because it's meant millions of lost working class votes.
Brendan, why do you think Labour didn't get the message on that in 2017? Because I think you all, both of you rather, have tried to remind Labour that they did actually lose that election, and there was a swing to the Tories in many of the heartlands that you mentioned earlier. I mean, to what extent do you reckon that things like votes at 17 with enthusiasm, and that just highlighted, didn't it, how completely out of touch they are with genuine concerns by the public out there?
You're absolutely right. And we watched with absolute amazement when, after the 2017 election, the party conference in September, which I believe took place in Brighton, voted in favour of free movement and saying we should not only maintain it, but extend it. And I remember at the time thinking, this is absolute insanity. We've just been rejected and lost an election on the basis that we supported the status quo, and then after that we go, well, hang on a minute, we just need to push a little bit more. And what it is, it's that one more heave mentality which many on the far left do have. They believe, that people haven't fully embraced the Labour Party because they haven't been exposed to it enough, and they need to be told a little bit more, and they need to hear it more frequently, and only when they've heard it enough and we've pushed enough, they'll then pick us and we'll come to power. We were since disproved that myth in 2 elections since then. You're right though, Darren, on other things too. Our obsession with, and I'm sure we'll discuss this a little bit too, the whole identity politics agenda, the whole appealing to the veins and wishes of youth, as opposed to caring for those communities that have never really recovered since deindustrialisation, addressing the fact that, as we've touched on free movement, there's a huge class element to it as well. If you've got middle class people with a multi-skill set that can be transferred, of course you're going to love free movement because you can very easily move around the continent. If you've got a plumber in this country, or if you've got a builder in this country, or someone with specific skill set or a low skill set, you can't just up sticks and move to Greece because the wages in your employment are far lower there than they would be here. Whereas wages such as doctors and nurses are relatively comparable if you take the standard of living and income levels in the country which you're going to. So there's a huge class element there. And again, where the Labour Party has become a more middle class party, full of speech writers and social scientists and history of art graduates, they are made up of that cosmopolitan group, and so have lost the affinity and understanding of those who we're there to represent. And that, I think, is the core of it. In terms of obsessing over things like votes at 16 and listening to the ridiculous People's Vote campaign and all the messages they were putting out, it was that echo chamber. You had people on Twitter tweeting other people saying, oh, we should support a people's vote. And they were saying, oh, yes, this is very progressive. And because it got several thousand retweets from people that agreed with them, they thought it was representative of the country. And when they went out to their constituencies and actually met real people, not freaks like us that are obsessed by politics and listen to what other people tweet, like, and all the rest of it, they got the truth brought to them. And so I hope that when Labour makes decisions in future, the first starting point should be, what's Twitter saying? Right, let's do the opposite. Because it's not representative of the Labour movement, actually, and the Labour Party. And when you speak to most Labour MPs privately, not on the record, but off the record, they agree with us. They know pursuing votes at 16 is nuts. They know maintaining our support for the EU is nuts. They know supporting free movement is nuts. And they know going down this whole identity politics agenda is also nuts. But because, unfortunately, we have a membership that has turned this cult of progressivism into a new religion, you dare not go against it, because you'll be cast out like someone in the Bible outside the city walls.
Paul, what do you think explains the party's obsession with youth then? And it has become so youth student focused, really, and its rejection of older voters as being, racist, bigoted, or gammons, basically, which is what Twitter thinks of them. It's this obsession, isn't it, with doing everything that Twitter will like. This obsession with Twitter, when what David Cameron says, I think, rings true. Too many tweets make a... I'll let you finish that next word. But why do you think that is? Why do you think there has been this rejection of older voters as being, these patriotic, racist bigots?
Well, I think because Labour is essentially now a party largely for students and social activists and middle-class liberals in the cities. I think that's a demographic shift within the Labour Party that's been taking place over the last 30 years. I've always argued that this is something that predates Jeremy Corbyn. Anyone who thinks that the Labour Party's rupture with the working class only came about when Jeremy Corbyn was elected leader doesn't really understand the history of the party. It was something that was happening well before then. The membership base of the Labour Party now, in a survey that was done a couple of years ago, showed that 77% of members fall into that social grade, the ABC1 middle class category. Many of those people are based in London, and you're quite right, they do mistake Twitter for Britain. They think that Twitter and Britain are the same thing, and we saw in 2019 that actually they're not. And the Labour base is very London centric. It has become, as I describe it, it's become too much Hampstead and not enough Hartlepool. The Labour Party has always... The success of the Labour Party electorally in the past has been based on an electoral compromise between, that old industrial working class, if you like, the traditional working class in its old heartlands, and that more middle class element, which are perhaps less tribal, more progressive in their outlook, more cosmopolitan. And it's by holding those two together in a coalition that Labour has achieved success. The problem is that in recent years, that coalition has become completely imbalanced, and the party's entire message and programme and ideology is pitched towards that kind of middle-class, city-based liberal element and away from the traditional working class. And because that second element now feels that the party doesn't look like them, doesn't sound like them, doesn't share their priorities, they've just abandoned it. And if you look at the Labour Party now, so much of it is so much of its activists are obsessed with putting front and centre what are really fringe issues, and not talking about the things that working class people want to talk about. So, on the everyday issues that affect people, immigration and law and order and the family and national identity and all of this sort of stuff, the Labour Party activists look down and shuffle their shoes in embarrassment when those issues are raised, because they're much more comfortable talking about trans rights or migrant rights or human rights or Palestine and gender identity and that sort of thing. Now, you can have that debate about those things. I'm not saying you shouldn't talk about those things, but the problem is the priority that the Labour Party attaches to those sort of fringe issues is in inverse proportion to what people out there in working class communities attach to them. And in summary, I think that is what has created the divide and led to the rupture between the working class and the Labour Party. Brendan was right when he said earlier that some people saw this coming. Something like 4 days before the election in December, I tweeted that our red wall was going to crumble. The vast majority of people in the Labour movement didn't see that happening, frankly, because they didn't go to those communities enough. They thought the world was like their friends on social media. They mixed in their own exclusive groupthink circles, and we can now see the result of that.
Well, speaking of being more London than Hartlepool, Sir Keir Starmer QC, a lawyer hailing from a trendy quarter of North London who's steeped in the politics of liberal cosmopolitanism, isn't he the embodiment of everything that yous have both just set out, and that gap, representing that gap and chasm between the party and its one-time core vote? Do you reckon he'll be able to win places like Bolsover and Blythe Valley back, Paul?
I think he's got an absolute mountain to climb. I mean, I'm not somebody who says that, simply because Keir Starmer is a lawyer from North London, that he should somehow be disqualified from being the leader of the party. I mean, if he had the right message and he was saying the right things, then of course he would be the right leader. And, it wouldn't be fair to say, well, because you're a lawyer, mate, and because you're from North London, you've got no right to lead the party. I think the problem is that, certainly he is associated with the suicidal second referendum policy. And with that being the case, and with him very much being part of that kind of liberal cosmopolitan group that now dominates the party in terms of ideology, the fact that he's a North London liberal lawyer just becomes an added problem, if you like. But the difficulty I think Keir Starmer has got is that whatever his own intentions, and I don't know the man personally, and I don't know what he's thinking, and I don't know if he really does understand what the size of the mountain is to be climbed to win those working class communities. I think the problem he's got is something that Brendan touched on earlier, is we've got a party which is so on the fringe with its priorities and with its obsessions that he's going to find it difficult, with the best will in the world, even if he was minded to follow the particular path that Brendan and I would like to see him follow. He's got to win over the party. And when you go to annual conferences in the Labour Party, as Brendan and I do, and Brendan touched on the extending free movement joke a couple of years ago, I mean, it was absolutely insane. He's right to say it. You see just how out of touch with these communities some of these activists are. They're much more comfortable, some of them, with maintaining their own purist ideology and saying how brilliant they are for defending their position, rather than doing the difficult thing of compromising and looking at what working class people are demanding. The no compromise with the electorate message, which seems to be what some of them are saying, one more heave mentality would just be another suicide note. But I fear that some people in the party are of that mind, and therefore Starmer's going to be limited in what he can do regardless of his intentions.
Well, Brendan, that must be right, isn't it? The Corbyn project seemed to be championed by those like woke communists at Novara Media instead of Blue Labour. Do you reckon that the party can return to being the home of titans like Barbara Castle and Peter Shaw under the likes of Keir Starmer? Do you think he can bring it back?
I think, and I should just premise this by saying, in the leadership election, I wasn't impressed really at all, but the one who I felt was closest to where I felt the party needed to go was Lisa Nandy. So I'm pleased she's on the front bench. She said a few mad things on identity politics, but apart from that, she ran a pretty sound campaign. On Sir Keir Starmer, he was the architect of the second referendum campaign. He was the main proponent in the shadow cabinet of rejoin and supporting the People's Vote effort. Now, I was extremely critical of him, and I even called for him to be sacked at one point, because we could see the disaster kamikaze election that was coming towards us. And it was as if everyone in the Labour Party just said, no, we don't care, let's go over the top together and be blasted apart. And that's what happened. Since his election, though, I have to say, I want to deal with the positives first. Mm-hmm. I have been impressed with his competence. Now, I know we were coming from a pretty low bar, but we do now have, I think, a competent leader of the opposition who is inquisitive, who's analytical, and who can perform the role. That's a positive, because I think democracy needs that. Secondly, Does he have the right message? Does he have the credibility? Now, of course, there are going to be people that say, you were the main proponent of Remain and second referendum. We will never vote for you because of that. But the reality is, let's move forward to 4 to 5 years' time when the next election is going to be. By then, if the government sticks to its current timetable, the question of our membership of the EU will be history. We will be out of the transition period. We will have some sort of arrangement with the EU. Now, of course, you could have a debate about rejoining, but I think it would be folly for Labour to do that. And in recent days, Sir Keir Starmer has been asked, would you support transition, an extension to the transition, sorry, and he's butted it away. Now, it's quite clear he wants to be Prime Minister. You know, a man who praises veterans on VE Day in the Daily Telegraph when you're Labour leader, you definitely want to be Prime Minister. And you're willing to do, I think it was either you, Darren, or someone tweeted saying this guy wants to be Prime Minister. And I think he does. And now he's just got to look at the electoral arithmetic here. If he continues to go down the Remain, Liberal, Progressive route, he's not going to be Prime Minister. He's not even going to get close. If he wants to get close, he's got to look to the red wall that we've discussed in this interview this morning. And I think yesterday could have been the first step on that journey. We know there were others in the shadow cabinet, like Angela Rayner and now Lisa Nandy, who were cautious about the idea of having a second referendum. In some of the votes, when Boris was bringing the deal back, some of those people now in the shadow cabinet did support him at various stages, and some of the junior ministers did. The shadow junior ministers did too. So are we at the beginning of a change in the mentality of the parliamentary party? I think we are, but we are at the very early embryonic stages of that change. The big battle, and there will be an almighty row in the Labour Party at some point in the future, there's going to have to be, will come when the debate goes to the membership on the type of party we now are moving to becoming. And that will be one almighty row. And I think it's important at that time that Sir Keir Starmer, if he is changing the party, maintains his strength. He's got a huge majority within the party, a huge endorsement to do really what he likes as leader. And we'll just have to watch this space. But on his performances so far and his statesman-like approach, I think that has been positive. I want to see more from him on the economy. We've got to get rid of this notion that we can borrow, spend. Everything's free, because it's not. There is no such thing as state money. Every penny in this country comes from taxpayers and businesses, and we have to be properly managing that money. And so
Brendan,
when we
you're
get
starting to sound quite Thatcherite there, mind.
No, Gatescalite. Thatcher was a student of Gates School. As soon as we get that into our heads and a right message on Brexit, I think we can start turning the tide.
I think you've both written in the past on the theme of localism and where communities that have been ignored for far too long are given purchase in society and over their own lives. I wonder if Labour were to actually support genuine devolution, not some half-assed attempt at it that we've seen so far, where, you know, we're actually focused on people who feel determinedly English, for example, are given more control over what happens to them. Because if you look at data from the OECD, it shows that the UK, and particularly England, is crazily centralised regarding tax powers, which are almost all controlled by Westminster. I wonder if one area where we might have agreement on both Conservative and Labour movement as far as putting Brexit to one side is concerned, but then focusing on our post-Brexit future, it might be this, on giving areas in England, and I'm not talking about regions, I think that focuses too much on the EU's idea of doing devolution. I'm talking about communities. I'm talking about devolution as close to the individual as possible, where we're actually given flexibility and less central control, which does lead to individual purchase over people's lives and really genuinely takes back control. Do you think that would be a winning platform, Paul?
Yeah, I think, you know, local democracy, civic community is always very important. I think people want agency and power over their own lives. So I think, you know, power should always be dissolved as much as possible to local communities. I think certainly you touched on the issue there, specifically, Darren, around England. I think the alienation, particularly of the English working class, has been pretty fundamental in some of the convulsions that we've seen politically in recent years. It was certainly a key factor in Brexit, the vote of the English working class. And in fact, there was a study done by the writer Anthony Barnett, who did some research, and he took two towns. He took Wigan in England and Paisley in Scotland, which were very similar in terms of their history, their industrial heritage, their demographic, etc. And in the referendum, the vote to leave in Wigan was, whatever the figure was, it was very high, and the vote to remain in Paisley was just as high the other way, despite the fact that these communities were very similar in every other way. So he used that example to highlight how specifically the English working class were driving some of this reaction to the philosophy of the establishment. So I think you do need to begin a debate about how because I think the English working class just feel that their national identity is almost irrelevant and is just dismissed. And I think it was George Orwell who said, no one hates their own country like the English intelligentsia. And I think that's probably still the case today, and I think that's a hangover from the belief among certain people that England is more associated with empire and has got blood on its hands in a way that some of the other constituent nations of the UK haven't. So Labour has got a particular problem with England. Labour hasn't won the popular vote in England since, I think it's 2001 in a general election, and none of the party's messaging is ever around England, whereas they're quite happy to have messaging around Scotland and Wales and stuff. So, that needs to be addressed, because it's, from a Labour perspective, that English working class vote has now gone Tory. If you actually look at the election in December, if you look at the C2DEs, which is broadly speaking the occupational working class, broadly speaking, that vote broke 48% for the Tories and 33% for Labour. That's UK-wide. I'm pretty sure that the disparity would be even more significant if you look specifically at England. And I guess that the problem for Labour is, the Tories, I think, have understood this. I think Dominic Cummings and other strategists have understood that if any party is going to be successful, then in an election, it needs to get the English working class. It needs to talk about things like regional inequalities and investment in infrastructure and bringing back, some blue-collar jobs and some stability to these communities. If the working class in England who voted for the Tories in December stay with the Tories, then Labour has got a big problem on its hands, because there is no route back to power for Labour that does not win back the Blythe Valleys and the Bolsovers and the Don Valleys and the Wrexhams and the Grimsbys, or Wrexham is not England obviously, but the others certainly. So unless, and this is where Brendan's right, Starmer needs to understand that if he's going to win power, he needs to win those people back, and we're only going to do that if there's a radically different message.
Brendan, as a Labour councillor, do you think that's right? Do you think it's focusing more on England and actually ensuring take back control actually means something to communities that did overwhelmingly vote leave? That's how Labour shows its patriotism.
I totally agree, Darren. I'm a member, and I think Paul's also a member of the English Labour Network, which is a group within the Labour movement that's campaigning for greater devolution to England and a greater awareness of issues relating to England. And one of those key things is patriotism. I won't repeat all of what Paul said, because I agree entirely. I think Labour should come out strongly for the creation of an English Grand Assembly or an English Parliament, whatever you want to call it. I think it's a mad situation where you've got Scots MPs and Welsh MPs voting on English-only issues, but you haven't got the situation where English MPs are voting on Scots domestic issues. It's just an unfairness in the system. We need to get rid of the House of Lords and have a federal chamber that represents all four nations of the UK. I think you need to have and I actually think COVID-19 is going to force a huge overhaul of the way England is governed at the local level, because at the moment we have got situations where local authorities are possibly starting to go bankrupt because of the situation we're in at the minute. I think people need to have greater control in that area. So, perhaps county authorities, get rid of these borough. We've got parish councillors, town councillors, borough councillors, county councillors, London mayors, London Assembly members, city region mayors, city councils. Why do we need all these people? We don't. Let's slim it down. Let's put it on a diet. English local government on a diet.
Well, that's exactly right. When Labour tried putting a North East Assembly in place, I mean, my God, the last thing we need is more bureaucrats and politicians, in my opinion.
Exactly, and it puts people off politics, because when they ring up to deal with their school and they're told, you don't go to this authority, go to that one. And then when they've got concerns with the health service in their local area, don't speak to that authority, speak to this one. Just peas people off, slim it down, sort it out, tidy it up. In terms of England as well, I think we need to create an English Labour Party. Why have we got a Scots Labour Party, Welsh Labour Party, but not an English Labour Party? In many ways, England, has been, as Paul rightly said, has been associated with the football hooliganism, with Empire, and with the English national, what's that idiot, Tommy Robinson set up that organisation, the English Defence League and all that. It's got really negative connotations. There was the famous image from Rochester, where Emily Thornberry tweeted the St George's flag and the white van. And there's this sort of contemptuous slight disdain of England, and it's amazing, really, when you consider, the symbol of England is the rose. The symbol of the Labour Party is the rose. Many of the great working class struggles originated in England. Many of the trade union movements originated in England. And the Scots, if anything, were more associated with Empire than the English. The Scots went out and founded the colonies. The English were sent to fight for them. That's how it was worked, really, throughout history. I think, too, the seats, as Paul touched on, England, we will not win again, ever, unless we reconnect with the English working class. And the English working class don't all live in Bolsover. They live all over England. Southwest, the southeast, the North Kent and Thames estuary towns. Go around the east coast of England, all the fishing towns are on the coast. We need to be pro-taking countries. I don't think Labour should give up on that. We need a settlement as well for the countryside. How can it be? If you look at some of the big regional inequalities in England, they are between the urban and the rural. Bus services in rural England are appalling. Health services in rural England, access to schools are appalling. These are working class issues. You've got this notion that all these people that live in villages own, their houses are worth a lot of money, but they're not culturally and in terms of their wealth, massive middle class people. They're quite working class. They don't have an enormous disposable income, and the costs of living are much higher because of the inequalities I've described. And if Labour taps into that, you could see a remarkable revolution in Labour's fortunes in England. And I hope, if Sir Keir Starmer, as I'm sure he does, tune into your show, Darren, he should be listening to what we're saying.
Well, I think that's a perfect time to end that. That was beautifully put, Brendan. Thank you both very much to the two of you for joining us. Where can people find you on Twitter? What's your Twitter handle, Paul?
It's as my name, just written as my name, Darren.
And Brendan?
Same here. Just
hey, you struck Twitter gold there, with the ability to do that. I had to have a little underscore in mine. Anyway, cheers very much, and I hope you have a fantastic day. Thanks again.
Thank you,
Darren.
Now, as ever, you can subscribe to this channel on YouTube and follow us on social media. Thank you very much for listening.